We're moving towards the end game now, when these objects begin to actually make a difference. In New York, especially, which is not the earliest state by any means, but an important,
the biggest
state.
New York is the most populous state in these years. The most number of people live here. So a victory in New York is big for that reason. There is a referendum on the ballot in 1915, which is what these broadsides are addressed to.
And I'm noticing that the broadsides seem to be addressed to men.
Yes.
As man to man.
Man to man. Remember, men have to vote for women's suffrage, and I've said there was a men's league for women's suffrage. There were buttons that men, to come back to the paraphernalia, we have pennants, we have ribbons, and we have buttons. There are buttons for all the different suffrage organizations, including one for male comrades of women's suffrage. I support women's suffrage sort of thing. So there's a lot of material that's addressed to men. And in 1915, the referendum throughout the state failed. Nobody stopped. People redoubled their efforts, and the same process happened in 1917. November 1917, there was a second referendum in New York State, and this time it passed. And the passage of the New York State referendum is so important in our national history. I'm surprised there isn't more fuss made about it, because it was the tipping point on the road to finally having a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. In New York, there were so many people that when New York women got the right to vote, it doubled the number of women in the whole country who could vote.
Wow. So it made a huge difference.
An enormous difference.
And then, of course, that's 1917, and
Right.
1919, Congress passes the women's suffrage.
And it's sent to the states for ratification, but it certainly looks, in hindsight, like New York is where the road curved. It's the first eastern state to endorse women's suffrage. The East was the real holdout, because it was the eastern states that had the most rigid gender caste system. Women's place is here, not in the public realm. And so I think that this is where the road swerved and the energy picked up toward final passage of the amendment.
It's fascinating, and yet the actual final passage was held up by the state of Tennessee, which was the last state to ratify, or the last state before ratification was complete. And here we have some perhaps true and false stories about ratification.
Well, many true and false stories. It brings me back to the idea that the suffrage story, wherever it is in America, is always a local story, in addition to being a national story. So the suffrage story in New York City is very much about who lives here. That's why the immigrants are so important, pro and as objects of fear by the voting public. That's why the moneyed interests that live here and the media that is here, this is the center of all of that, is so open to exploration about the particular neighborhoods and the particular places. And the same is true across the country. So Tennessee is the home of Jim Beam whiskey. And one of the great fears about women's suffrage was that since it had originated in some streams as part of the temperance movement,
Exactly.
that if women won the right to vote, they would outlaw alcohol, which is being considered in the temperance movement as really the center of what we would call domestic violence today. So there is a great fear, particularly in Tennessee, I would suspect, of what this will mean. And it's not surprising that Tennessee is the last state to ratify it. I think this is a myth about Tennessee, that a man named Burns was the holdout. The sides were even. It was 50-50, pro and con. And it came down to this young man who stood up and he took a letter from his pocket and he read it to the assembled. And it was a letter from his mother that said basically, be a good boy and do the right thing for women's suffrage. But I've been reading the correspondence of all the people involved in this movement all over the country. And the night before this young man stood up with his mother's note, he was taken to dinner by some of Alice Paul's co-workers. And so I suspect that flourishing the letter was yet another piece of theatricality in a political movement that's full of theatrical gestures.
I like to believe that Alice Paul and her gang had had some influence on Harry Burns.
I suspect they did.
Thank you, Louise.
Thank you.